Okay, guys, I'm gonna say subscribe 1,000 times. You ready? Go. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. That's hard. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. We hit 100. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Make sure you subscribe. Hit the bell notification. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. subscribe, 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 subscribe. Okay, almost there. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Subscribe, 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 subscribe. Make sure you hit the bell notifications and subscribe, 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 subscribe. Everybody, make sure you hit the bell notifications and subscribe. See you later.